There is a hot new trend in action game marketing that I'm seeing develop, where new action games coming out now are using the Souls formula as the template and foundation of what their combat design is. And that makes sense because that way they can tap into the massive FromSoft audience without too much barrier, without having to explain how the game works too much. There's that instant recognizability that people will jump at and say, oh yeah, I know what's going on here. Oh, this looks really cool. But since the Souls-like has become a really common style of action game design now, I would say it is the predominant style of action game design now, these developers want to do something that sets their game apart. They can't just make a crappy clone of Dark Souls or Elden Ring and get away with it. They need to do something that's different, that's interesting, that makes sense. And what seems to be the new idea and concept that everyone is going to as well, why don't we just invoke the popular action game design of the past, like Ninja Gaiden or Devil May Cry? We'll just take a few little surface elements of these games, we'll kind of sprinkle it over the top of Dark Souls, and boom! There you go, baby. A Souls character action hybrid that everyone can get into and everyone can love. And I'm not against this idea per se, especially because this is basically what Team Ninja did a few years back with the Nioh series. That is what Nioh is. It's like a combination of character action concepts put into a Dark Souls framework. But the problem I'm having with this sort of approach, especially in the marketing, is that since people really want their game to stand out more, they're really pushing this sort of comparison to Devil May Cry and Ninja Gaiden in a way that I don't think is very accurate, or I don't think is very respectful to the original design of these games. Because the problem I'm having isn't that people are taking influence from these games that I love, which I think is great. The problem is that the conversation around this, because of marketing and because of all that, is getting really reduced to the point that I think people are starting to lose touch with what is character action, what is Devil May Cry, what is core to Devil May Cry's design. Because with this Phantom Blade Zero
Games Radar
thing, for example, they were saying that that game is 70% Ninja Gaiden and Devil May Cry. 70%. Okay, so if this is 70% a character action game, then it should have the foundations of what makes character action. And then I've noticed in the sort of general discussion, no one is really laying out, okay, what is character action? What is foundational to Devil May Cry? What makes Devil May Cry special? And so far, the consensus I'm seeing, or like the general idea I'm seeing, is like, well, Devil May Cry is all about like style switching and doing air juggles. So if you take style switching and you take air juggles and you put it in your game, boom, that's basically Devil May Cry. Like, that's what Devil May Cry is. But what I really want to highlight in this video, because for the past few months I've been playing Devil May Cry 3 non-stop in this pursuit to try to review and summarize the game. And if I can describe Devil May Cry 3 real quickly here, and this will tie into the general concept, is that when I was a teenager, I read a novel called House of Leaves about a family who moves into this house, and then they discover that their basement opens up into this endless black maze that defies the laws of physics. That is Devil May Cry 3. When I started to play Devil May Cry 3 really seriously for this review a few months back, I have just found, as I keep playing the game, it's that maze in terms of mechanics. When you start to play the game, you think, oh, there's just some surface elements here of you launch enemies into the air, you do air step combos, and then you land and taunt and you build up your meter, and that's that. Simple, easy peasy. But as I'm sitting down and playing Devil May Cry 3 and just going through, the mechanical depth of this game is endless. Just when you think you know how everything works, you find a paradigm-shifting revelation just around the corner. Then you recontextualize everything, and then you go through it again, and every single time I'm just revising. Oh my god, when does this game ever stop? For example, I'll give you a little quick insight, is that I was learning and doing the Royal Guard mechanic, and then I was watching, okay, well, how do people use the Royal Guard mechanic? How do they use it to get S ranks? And then one day I'm watching this Japanese player use Royal Guard in the start of stage 1 and kill 3 enemies instantly. And I'm like, what? How did that happen? And so I'm sitting there like, okay, he only parried once, and then he gets this instant kill. What's going on here? So then I get real close to the computer and I play back the footage like one frame at a time. I'm like watching, what is he doing? How is he able to do this? And then I reverse engineer and realize, oh, apparently Devil May Cry's Royal Guard attack mechanic has counter hit properties, where if you do it during a counter hit, it powers up and gets even stronger. I'm like,
What the? What, Capcom?
what developer would think of this? Some point in this game's development, somewhere programming the Royal Guard attack mechanic, the guy's like, let's just throw in some counter hit properties to this. I think it's awesome, but the point I'm getting at is that we need to remember the context from which character action games, especially Devil May Cry, was spawned. What is the lineage? Where does this come from? And how is it actually very different from playing Elden Ring and then adding in air juggles or whatever these developers are going to do? Like, the massive difference in design philosophy between these two examples is not getting articulated and captured. And like I said, I'm not against the concept of adding in some fun, cool mechanics like that into the Souls clones, but what I want to point out here is how special and unique this era of game design is, and how you can't just replicate it by copying and pasting a few mechanics, that there is a much deeper layer to this lasagna or the iceberg. There's a whole giant iceberg underneath this little tip that everyone seems to just be staring at and thinking that represents the philosophy of this series design, when I think it is metaphorically just the tip of the iceberg. So I'm going to lay out a few things for you all that I think are the foundations of what Devil May Cry is as a series, and what really has to be tapped into if you're trying to replicate what that series is up to. To begin with, the important thing to understand about Devil May Cry is that it comes from an arcade lineage. That Capcom, when they were making the Devil May Cry series, was in their golden era, or at the end of their golden era, of beat-em-up arcade and fighting game design. And that Devil May Cry itself was influenced by Capcom's own lineage of fighting game development and beat-em-up development. And what Devil May Cry is kind of doing is marrying together these two elements in 3D and then slapping it into a survival horror context. And so in terms of the lineage of this series, it is actually a combination of the three genres that Capcom themselves pioneered or solidified, whichever word you want to use, where they set the template for fighting games with Street Fighter II, with beat-em-ups, with Final Fight, and then survival horror with, of course, Resident Evil. You take these three design influences, you shove them all together, and basically what you get is Devil May Cry. And what Devil May Cry is doing in terms of game mechanics is really unique, and it is something we're not going to see replicated anytime soon, because I don't think even modern day Capcom could quite replicate what the hell they were doing back in the early 2000s. Because if you go back to the context of the early 2000s and just game design during this era, this is my favorite era of game design because it is the most technical, it is the most mechanically rich of all of video game history. This era, the early 2000s, the late 90s, all the arcade developers were really pushing game mechanics to the limits to where it overwhelmed most of the major player base. Look at all the popular stuff at this time. You've got Street Fighter Alpha, you've got Street Fighter 3, you got Virtua Fighter 3 to Virtua Fighter 4. You've got Guilty Gear XX to the many versions of Guilty Gear XX, and of course Marvel vs. Capcom 2. And even on Nintendo's side, you've got Mario Sunshine and Super Smash Bros. Melee. This is just the era where it was hot to push the mechanical development of your game and of your series. And then that kind of fell apart because it turned out to be really overwhelming for players. And so since that point, the 2000s era, pretty much every other series has been
Backpedaling.
And so going back to Devil May Cry 3, this is the era that game was born. And what Devil May Cry 3 is essentially trying to do is marry together the open-ended style of playing fighting game characters with the scoring arcade nature of arcade games. And that creates an interesting conundrum in terms of game design, because with fighting games, there is no objective, correct fighting game style. Whatever you do to win is correct, and everyone has their own different approach to winning. You have the Justin Wongs of the world who play very defensively. You got the aggressive guys like Kazunoko. You have a whole spectrum of different styles and approaches fighting game players can take into their game. And as long as it's getting the win, it is valid, at least in terms of the video game. Y'all can have your own opinions, but if the game sees you win, that is valid, whatever you did in the game design aspect. But in arcade scoring games, because you have the objective metric of score telling you objectively which playstyles are more effective and good than others, you lose that sort of freedom of expression. But the trade-off is you get contextual meaning and a way to evaluate a performance. So there's kind of an interesting trade-off there. The open-ended fighting game freestyle version, which can only be contextualized socially, essentially, or by, tournaments, metagame elements outside of the game itself. That is how we know which players are the best in the world, because of external metagame that people engage in. Or you can have the alternative, which is really cool in scoring games, of you can objectively say which player is the best in the world purely on numbers. Whoever gets the highest number is the best. Basically, that's how it works. And so both have their strengths and their weaknesses. And what Devil May Cry 3 especially is trying to do is marry these two conflicting design philosophies. They aren't naturally compatible with one another. And so Capcom is trying to make this fusion happen. And this is how you get the style system of Devil May Cry. And the style system is very interesting of a concept. And the way it works is a hybrid approach where Capcom are trying to get you to play in specific restraints, but they're not going to be completely rigid in how they evaluate those constraints. This is where you get the ranks at the end of the stage, and these ranks are disconnected from one another, and you as the player need to marry together the different concepts. At least in 3, 4 actually sums them together, which is really interesting, but we'll talk about 4 later. But in 3, as long as you're balancing all of these different metrics together, you end up with an S rank at the end, and you actually don't have to S rank everything. By the way, you can get an A in a few of them, and they will still sum together for an S. But as long as you get that S at the end, whatever you did to achieve that S is equal to whatever this other guy did to achieve his own S rank. So that is where style comes from. That's why it's called style, because if it was a true scoring system, one approach would be objectively better than another because you'd get a higher score. But because the style system is capping how far you can push the scoring elements of the game, essentially, it creates this sort of limit that makes a lot of play styles equally valid, but it does actually filter through some more degenerate play styles. So it isn't completely open-ended like with modern action games now, where there is no performance evaluation and it is all just purely subjective.
I learned early on when I started playing this game that people have a tendency of putting other people down for the way they play the game.
Man. I just stopped smoking yesterday.
It's a single player game, and everyone is, has the right to play it however they want to have fun. But I noticed immediately that this is just the thing. You want to put people down for playing the game in any way that's different than you. So that's when I started imposing all these weird, totally arbitrary rules on myself, and then insulting everyone who doesn't agree.
There are some objective metrics that Capcom is wanting to see. They want you to do certain things, and they will reward you with the style ranks for that. So you have to play their game a little bit, but in that game, you're also allowed to express yourself. It's a really interesting way to approach this sort of mechanical performance style game design that not a lot of other series have attempted and hasn't really been iterated on much since this point, where nowadays, Dark Souls, Elden Ring, you name it, modern action games now, a lot of them drop this concept of style or ranking or performance evaluation, and it's all purely subjective to how you feel about whatever people are doing. But I think this performance evaluation is core to character action, is core to the Devil May Cry series, much more so than doing air juggles. There are tons of games out there that are lame or not that have air juggles and combos, and you can do little combo videos and say, oh, isn't the combat deep? Air juggles and technical little things like that are not what make combat deep. What makes combat deep, like in Devil May Cry, is performance evaluation. Even if that performance evaluation is somewhat limited in Devil May Cry 3 because there is a cap to how far you can perform well, even that bar, asking at least that much of the player, brings them much deeper into the core game design than they would otherwise. Trust me, if you sit down and just play Devil May Cry 3 for survival and just getting through the end without dying, I mean, it is a cool game, it's still a lot of fun, but it isn't nearly as deep or engaging as if you have to then jump into this style performance metric system where everything starts to kind of matter. Like, a lot of stuff matters, and then a lot of like degenerate strategies that you could kind of use start to not be possible. For example, if you watch a lot of like combo mat and combo videos, one thing you can see people do is like launch every enemy into the air individually and like air combo them forever individually one by one. How you do that actually has to be a lot more nuanced and subtle if you're playing for ranks, because if you just spam the same move over and over and over, it actually drops rank. Even if you have them in the air juggling, you can't build rank just spamming the same move. So you have to engage with a lot more of what the game is going for, even with that certain requirement. But then there's other requirements that come in as well, like time. So you can't sit there and spam guns on things too much because you need to kill them quickly enough. Or you can't sit there and just kill one enemy one by one, in Dante Must Die at least. You need to group kill them because you need to kill them faster together because of time. So there's a lot of different metrics and things that this performance evaluation system actually improves upon and makes the game design stronger, but none of that is being discussed or captured in today's conversation around character action games and this discussion around, well, Phantom Blade Zero is 70% Devil May Cry or Ninja Gaiden or whatever.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean,
the game's yet to be released. I could be surprised, but let's say that I'm skeptical, especially since Stellar Blade made this very same claim, and it is no, it's nowhere near the depth or quality of Devil May Cry, and I think it's kind of misleading to even attempt to compare that game to Devil May Cry, and I talked all about that in my very beloved review of Stellar Blade. But what I'm getting at, and it's hard to face as a character action fan, is that the Devil May Cry era of action game design is over. It is something of the past in terms of mainstream relevance and popularity. And I know everyone was excited about Devil May Cry 5, and I haven't fully analyzed Devil May Cry 5. I'm suspending my thoughts on that for the time being. But is Capcom in a rush to make Devil May Cry 6? And then the people who engaged with Devil May Cry 5, how deep does that go? And once the Devil May Cry crew retire, who's going to replace them? Who even has the talent, ability, and understanding to create games of the same mechanical depth and impressive balance as classic Devil May Cry? I mean, we've seen what Western developers are capable of doing when they are literally asked, make a Devil May Cry game. We see what they come up with, and we also see the reception to this game among mainstream critics, which was like, yeah, that's kind of close enough for me. I mean, I get it. Yeah, it's kind of there. Here's a depressing stat for you all. If you go ahead and fire up Metacritic, you will see that Devil May Cry 4 Special Edition actually has a lower Metacritic score than DM Definitive Edition on Metacritic. Isn't that a little bit disturbing? Am I the only one who sees a problem with this picture? DMC4 isn't a perfect game, but it is leagues, miles better, just at a core foundational level. I mean, this is the type of stuff I'm talking about. And the reason why I wanted to make this video is because I do not want to see Devil May Cry's legacy and lineage just be simplified into the most surface element observations of its gameplay so that when these new Souls-based action games come out and then claim to be 70% character action, I want there to be an understanding when I come into this review and say, it's not matching these elements, that we have a touchstone, a shared understanding of what makes Devil May Cry special, what makes it so unique, and something we're not going to see anytime soon. Because in order to catch up with what Devil May Cry was up to during that era would take a lot more fundamental shifts in how action games are designed now than just throwing in some auto combos or cool looking juggles or whatever they think is going to make it Devil May Cry. Because the problem with making a true Devil May Cry style game in the year 2024 is that its level of mechanical complexity and its level of just depth and inaccessibility is actually going to hurt your game in terms of sales. In modern game design philosophy, if you buy a game and then you start playing it and you need to pause the game and go and research how the mechanics work, and you need to go frame by frame in high-level gameplay videos to understand that certain moves have counter hits or just the overall picture of how things are coming together. Basically, if you need to study the game's fundamental mechanics in any sort of way, that is going to hurt your game in terms of sales, and it's going to hurt your game in terms of approachability. Modern developers know this. Everyone knows this. This is why Guilty Gear Strive is Guilty Gear Strive. And look at the sales data. Look at the sales and active player base of Guilty Gear XX and Guilty Gear Strive, or even Xrd in Strive. Look at the difference between these two. Look at the popularity of Dragon Ball FighterZ. I think Dragon Ball FighterZ was Ark's turning point for the worst because they released that. They have the license, they have the simplified mechanics, they have massive sales, and they're like, boom, baby, it's Strive time. And we're seeing this across the board with many series. It would actually take a lot of balls and counterintuitive modern game design philosophy to create something that you could credibly claim as a real successor or 70% Ninja Gaiden or Devil May Cry. There's a reason why Capcom is like, Devil May Cry 6, I don't know. Or Team Ninja are like, Ninja Gaiden 4, I don't know. The reason for that is because the amount of dev costs and energy that go into making these games just mechanically and then balancing all of these mechanics is insane. It is actually unreal that Capcom were able to create something as dense and ambitious as Devil May Cry 3 in the first place. Devil May Cry 3 isn't the perfect game in a lot of ways, but it is absolutely one of the most ambitious games ever created. And the further I dig into the game, I'm like, when does it end? It just goes on and on and on. It's crazy how deep this game truly is. And it makes complete sense that Capcom's follow-up to Devil May Cry 3, DMC4, was such a complicated, messy game, and how it had so much trouble in development. And you sure Capcom are like, what the hell are we thinking? We're just building something that even we can't follow up on and manage. And especially since most of the player base out there, most of the critics out there, most of the gaming public out there don't even care, or the amount of people who are digging into the depths of these games versus the amount of people who just kind of play through them and engage them on the surface level, it makes complete sense in a grim way, in a sad way, that these Japanese developers were like, this isn't worth it. This is way too much. But that being said, I don't want to just skirt past what they actually accomplished, and I think that all needs to be re-examined and re-evaluated outside of just buzzwords and buzz phrases, because I'm finding it very frustrating right now that the way things are going, these games are just going to get lumped in as buzzwords for marketing purposes, and then modern developers making less ambitious games are going to get higher sales than these mad works of the past, and they're going to smugly think to themselves, yeah, we figured it out. We totally did it better than Capcom did. We saw what they were kind of trying to pull off in DMC3, but we figured out, yeah, really all that matters is just making the player feel accomplished or making the player feel like they're doing something technical when really they're just mashing the same set of buttons over and over, or there's no performance analysis, just everything you do is great. This is going to be a tide I can see myself battling with these upcoming releases. It began with Stellar Blade, and it's just going to continue release after release. I'll just continue to piss off the internet. Phantom Blade, Zero next, and we'll just go down the line. But in the process, I'm hoping to at least point out what elements of the Devil May Cry series are so fantastic and so overlooked. And I know that they're overlooked because as I was working on my S ranks for Dante Must Die, and that project is still ongoing, but even in these early stages, as I was working on these S ranks and genuinely wondering about certain mechanics, like how exactly is the style rank score calculated, or how does the taunt actually work? When does it reset? What resets it? Is the reset context sensitive? Can this mechanic be abused? You know, all of these types of more in-depth mechanical questions that I've been trying to research. It's actually funny how little information there is on all this stuff. I'm sure there's some Japanese guide out there that just nails it all and explains it all, but in terms of like English written guides, you can find information about how the voice lines of Dante change based off of your style rank, but how exactly the style rank is calculated, you're going to have to figure that out a little bit on your own, and I'll cover that and all my DMC3 stuff coming up. But the point being, I think the true Devil May Cry era is behind us, unfortunately. We may get Devil May Cry 6, which will be really cool, but what I mean is that the era in which action games are pulling genuine influence from Devil May Cry outside of these surface elements, I think that's coming to an end. I mean, we're not even seeing style systems anymore. We're not even seeing performance ranking anymore. I think all of that is kind of coming to an end in terms of the more modern action game take on combat. And instead, we're just going to get modernized takes on this style of game design that are going to be a lot less interesting and ambitious, but will still get the credit for being character action, unfortunately. And so if you enjoyed this video, please check out my recent God Hand review, another all-time classic that I really dig into and I think more people should be checking out and paying attention to. And if you can, please like, subscribe, tell all your friends. I'm going full-time in September, and that is going to include a lot of Devil May Cry and Dark Souls and a lot of this character action in-depth analysis. That's a big project I have coming up in the horizon. So any Patreon support would be greatly appreciated. And keep an eye out because my next video is going to be my merch drive for my new shirt. I'm really excited for that, and that's going to really help contribute to me going full-time. So thank you very much. Adios, everyone. So thank you to the $5 patrons, 100, Absconditis, Accepting Panda, Admiral Coconut, Anhold, AJA, Alexander Pfeiffer, Analgesic Productions, Anthony A, Arcade Hell, Arrow Viper, Au Alai, Autonamed, Beelit, Beam Pit, Bo, Beetle Dames, Boghog, Board Basmati, Borgie22, Chase Palumbo, Chris Yusufovich, Christopher R, Chronic Burnout 3, Claire Cliff, Clay Binkley, Climby Coyote, Coast, Colorboy, Cooksen666, Cooks and Soup, Des Audio, Dances with Incels, Darren Griffin, Dave Hansen, David Andrus, David Crespo, Delta Tango 6, Dingo, DJ420 Price It, Drano, Dr. Bosky, Elbin Senesev, Elias Alonso, Eric Houdini, FCK, F Deluxe, Friskin, Frames Per Human, Francisco, Freckle Lord, Full Set, Game Boy Guru, Geese Machine, GPM, Gustavo Sanchez, Harun Khan, Hausu, Hero Death, Hiki Hime, HUD, JDab, Jake Ryan, Jack Walsh, Jacob Valenzuela, JLab, JBRPG, Jeffel, Jink Hans, John Kelly, John Longwalker, Josh Mayer, Jurgen, K, K2, Contain, Praise the Boys, Lord Harrington, Lorraine, Malaise, Mario Simic, Mark Sloan, Mars Bar, Matt O'Leary, Maz, Minung, Meister, Jam, Milo Shamel, Monroe, Nathaniel Davis, Neon Decker Games, Nile Agitis, Okla Kugels, Paolo Parole, Pedro Perez, Poorly Written Protagonist, Psycho Blizzard, Queen Charlene, Ralph Trujillo, Raul, Rapido, Real Skeen, Rentholtz Time, Retro Schmupper, Rory Starks, Rolf015, Ryan Bartlett, Scanline City, Segfault, Chassis, Shmup Junkie, Sirapong, Sparta Mad, Spiders STG, Spongy, Steady AI, Steve Fiction, Street Magic, Superfunk, Tamzarian, Taze Ryu, The Boot Rex, The Dirty Screech, VN1, The Old Bensta, Tim French, Toho Rizardi, Travis Arbon, Tsugumu, Tsuwayu, Twilight EX, Unikoi Roots, Ursua, Mushi Mushi, Vic Viper, Beautiful, Labby Legs, What Is This, Zachary Patton, Zeal, and Zen Ryoku.